far and away, when you begin thinking about preservation in all of American history, let alone at the Gettysburg battlefield, one of the primary points to come to is a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1896, the U.S. versus the Electric Railway. And at this time, that genteel tourism had included the construction privately of rail lines, trolley systems that went with their rails directly out to Devil's Den and right through the road system that we know of there today. This was something that the GBMA fought at every turn, but they were finding more and more that they had a very limited authority over private development and over individuals and what they wanted to do on the battlefield. And with that in mind, they began steps to federalize the battlefield, to make it not private anymore, but a public thing administered by the United States government in some way. The vehicle for accomplishing this turned out to be the ruling in 1896 by the U.S. Supreme Court, in which they essentially say, as you see in the quote that I have here, that these places are too important to be left to private hands. That it is part of the nation's fabric that this place be preserved, managed, and maintained. And this is when you see the shift over to the federal government. In the 1890s, as this shift took place, things went on the battlefield that are unbelievable to people involved with the battlefield today. Preservation took many different forms. And in this case, some of it, as I have depicted here primarily, is what we would expect. I mean, we didn't think monuments just grew there. They had to happen. This is when you would have the opportunity given to the Department of War to construct the road systems, to put the monuments in place, and to begin to make this something that could be used for educating soldiers in particular. That was their goal. And at this point, it's what I refer to as the useful sacred. And as you move through World War I, you would find that the battlefield, in addition to hosting these kind of activities, was used for tank drills and also used for prisoners, as a prison camp for prisoners of war. So the useful sacred actually turned out to be very unacceptable to the surviving veterans. And even though maybe they agreed with the use of the federal government, they did not agree with what the battlefield was becoming in terms of its use as open space for military practice. And it began a process through the 1920s when veterans groups complained officially to 1933 when the battlefield officially moved into the auspices of the National Park Service. Still the federal government, but now the National Park Service. This is where I really condense the story. It moves into a very fascinating twists and turns that I'm sure Greg can tell us a little bit more about. But for our purposes, thinking about the space, the landscape, the nature, we move from the useful sacred to the tourist sacred. And you have a National Park Service. I always tell my students, picture Yogi Bear. This is when the space was meant to facilitate tourism, and sacred had less to do with it. So it's a useful view of the space, but now the users are going to be tourists. And in particular, you have the automobile tourist become the focus of National Park Service actions from post-World War II forward. And to condense this mightily, you have such a vision of the sacred that all these things became components of it. Things built like the former visitor center and cyclorama that you see over on the side there, that were built directly on the battlefield at Ziegler's Road, something that would never have been entertained today. that the National Park Service decided to do itself at a time of different priorities and different ideas about the sacred. This provides one of the lessons that we keep coming up against, which is simply that public expectations do not remain static, and preservation efforts, whether it's by the National Park Service or other entities, must adjust with them. I think this becomes most obvious as we move into what I refer to as the culture of authenticity. When we move into an era graduating from dioramas to reenactments, an era when living history became the preference, and to see something visually became the priority. And this functioned on many different levels, and an event like the release of the Gettysburg movie in 1993 simply acts to underline, underscore the public desire, the public expectation for the authentic, for the genuine. That is meant to sound a little goofy to you, that a film version inspires people that things need to be more authentic. But that is the thinking of the postmodern era as we move through the end of the 20th century. And once again, a place like Gettysburg, now administered by the National Park Service, has to respond. In addition, they have to respond to competition, challenges. And this is when you saw the Disney plan to build a park at Manassas, to create different opportunities that grew out of the Civil War experience. And you very clearly saw the National Park Service identify that it had to do something differently, that it had to change its concept of preservation to accommodate some of these new expectations of the public. So all of that is primarily introductory. And in the last few slides here, I want to stimulate you to think about deeply what went on from that point forward. Again, preservation as something to satisfy customers, the public, and what needs to happen to that space. This is what I refer to as the landscape of authenticity. I mentioned the deer in my opening. And this is when you saw the mandate come down, one step at a time, that the natural environment of the battlefield was now going to be a primary portion of the preservation effort. It was not just going to be context anymore. And something like family, like the deer that had grown mightily in population on the battlefield, were going to make that process of reinterpreting and restoring the landscape all but impossible. And so that needed to be taken away. The next step was to create a management plan. Each national park has a GMP, a General Management Plan. It was the 1999 General Management Plan that put into effect these concepts of restoration, the need for an active approach to landscape management, where we would begin to see the ecology become a tool of preservation. And then, of course, the cultural resources were also in need of change. And this is when you have the very famous, I think, galvanizing event of modern preservation, the implosion of the tower that was built in the 1970s.